Yeah. Bass. Turn up.
Parents need more education options for their children. Teachers should be afforded more freedom to teach without big government interference. If we really want to make American education great again, the dollars to fund public education should follow the child.
You're listening to the Rickey Revelations podcast. Here is your host, Richard Norman Rickey.
All right, I've got two guests today for our podcast. I really appreciate these guys coming on. Let me introduce it to you. This is Colonel Shelby Little and Commander Tommy Turner with the Williamson County Grays. Gentlemen, thanks for coming. Let's have a great discussion today.
Thanks for having us.
Indeed. Start with you, Shelby. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a native Texan. I have born down in Pasadena, just outside of Houston, and grew up, born and raised there, and then went to school at the University of Houston, graduated, went right into the Army after that, and basically spent 30 years both in the active service and also with the Texas National Guard as a tank officer. And I've been here in Georgetown since 2007. Except for the times that I was overseas, either in working in Afghanistan or in Africa. So I've been with the Grays since about 2008. At that time, it was the Dixie Camp.
Oh, okay, Dixie Camp.
We changed our name to have something more Williamson County oriented, and of course the Williamson County Grays were an actual unit formed here in Georgetown in 1861.
Are the Grays associated with any other Grays anywhere else, like in Delaware or any other parts of the country?
Well, if you go back into history at that time, many of the militia units throughout the country had Grays as part of their name, Grays or Blues or whatever. And so we're not affiliated other than with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And there are a number of our camps. We have about 100 camps here in Texas. And they are all kinds of names that are based on something that's familiar to the local area where they are located.
So Tommy, a little bit more about that association with the Confederate, is it the Sons of Confederate Veterans?
Yes.
So what's the relationship? How does that work?
The organization was founded in 1896. It's based in Tennessee. Its mission was to really, at that time of its inception, was to assist with soldiers, veterans who were still alive from the war, help them. There was no VA hospitals back then, so they helped them as best they could with financial issues, with hospital medical issues. They assisted in providing some transportation for reunions. Reunions were a big thing back then on both sides. And that's how they began, and then it really was to continue to study history and the meaning behind the war between the states, the issues associated with that, and helping to educate the populace as to what that was all about.
So your group gets together. Do you recruit? How does somebody become a member of the Williamson County Grays?
Usually it's through word of mouth. We do have some social media, but usually someone who meets one of us, either in our capacity as camp members or again, word of mouth, they'll get in touch with us and say, hey, I've always been interested in getting involved in an organization that studies that particular time of our history, and I do think that a prerequisite is for them to have had a member of their family tree who served in the war between the states on the South, in the Confederacy. And so if they don't know exactly how to go about doing that genealogy, we can assist with that, and oftentimes we end up finding things that they even didn't know about, and then they complete paperwork and they become official camp members.
So your mission locally, how would you describe your mission locally? Why are you here in Williamson County, organized as the Williamson County Grays?
Pretty much the same mission as our national organization. We're just a bunch of mostly old guys, some retired, some not, who are interested in that period of history. We obviously have family members that go back to that era, and we're always wanting to learn more about that because, as most people know, there wasn't a whole lot recorded back then, very few photographs and written history of each of our members. So we do research into that and share that with our other members. We bring in speakers who have some knowledge of some aspect of the war between the states. And again, it's no less like the Optimist Club or the Rotarians. It's just that we study that particular time of history, and that's what where our interests lie.
So is there when you get together, like a pledge or a song that people do when they join, that you do like on a religious kind of a
do
ritual?
the pledges of allegiance to the United States flag, to the Texas flag, and to the Confederate First National flag. And the only other thing we do following the meeting, we have some business, adopt minutes and and so forth.
Yeah.
And then you usually have a speaker, and we talk amongst ourselves, and then we dismiss with a prayer, both an invocation and a benediction.
Okay, yeah. Shelby, I've seen you guys out at the square in front of the monument. The monument is called what's the actual name for that particular monument, memorial?
We look at it as the Williamson County Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Memorial.
Okay. And you guys are out there a lot, so obviously that's a part of what you do. Why are you there? And you guys are there. Tell me, how often are you there? When did it get started, and why are you there?
Well, most recently, we have been there for the past 32 months, every week.
32 months?
Yes, sir.
Every week almost?
Correct. And that is...
Are you guys getting paid to do this?
No, we are not. Other than the personal gratification that we get from the populace who come by and very enthusiastically tell us how much they appreciate us being out there and standing up for history. And so that's all the payment that we ask for.
So you guys are out there, and obviously your objective in spending so much of your own time and effort is what? What is it you want to accomplish by being there and committing yourselves to that cause? Like, I mean, how many other people spend that much time on something they really apparently believe in to take up that much of your weekends? Why are you doing it?
Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah.
like I said, this past 32 months, we started this on June the 3rd of 2020. Remember it well. And that was, of course, in the aftermath of the George Floyd situation, whenever everything kind of blew up, including here in Williamson County. And so we've had various groups, let's say, under a particular umbrella that have been out there almost as much as we have, and trying to get people to sign a petition to have the memorial removed. And so that is why most recently, I personally have been out since 2008, that April is Confederate History and Heritage Month in Texas. And
I think some people want that to go away, don't they?
That's correct.
Okay, I remember reading about that. They don't want it.
They don't even know about Confederate History and Heritage Month. They know about Confederate Heroes Day, which we just observed on the 19th of January.
Okay, that's a state? Is that a state?
Correct.
Okay.
And so they don't know about that, but we take that opportunity not only to come out and do what we've been doing most recently, but also there's over 1,000 Confederate veterans buried here in Williamson County throughout the 240-odd cemeteries that are here. And so one of our main jobs, when we're not doing this, is to go out and find these graves, locate them, document and catalog those veterans who are buried there, and tell their story. All of them have a story.
Yeah, so you're there because of this memorial that some people don't want to be there. Of course, this is controversial all over the country. Our memorials, that if some people don't think they're politically correct, they want them to be gone. So I want to talk about how that memorial got there in just a minute. But let me also continue on this path of why you're there. So obviously you're there because some people have stated they want this thing to go away, and you want it to stay, correct? I mean, you believe it should stay. You want it to stay. and that's part of the reason you're there. But you're there for hours and hours over all these weekends for these many, many weeks. Certainly there's got to be you could be having a lot of conversations with people. What are you trying to convey? What's the message you're conveying when you're talking to people?
That's been the most interesting part of this whole saga, is that we have talked to literally thousands and thousands of people, locals as well as out-of-staters, as well as people from throughout the world.
That's right.
And they're all curious. They all share in being curious about why we're there and what that monument represents. And some are incredulous that we're even having to do this. But even before, just backing up a little, even before we have done this, we were out there periodically throughout the year to commemorate certain times of the year that tied in with the monument, whether it was Memorial Day,
Veterans Day,
Veterans Day, Confederate Heroes Day, which incidentally corresponds with Robert E. Lee's birthday on January the 19th. That's why the state adopted that particular date in 1930. In 1930. So this has been around a long time. So we would be out there either dressed or not dressed, and to commemorate those specific days. Then this came along, like Shelby said, in 2020, and it wasn't just us, it was a nationwide issue, as we all know, and monuments were starting to be threatened, and they were defaced, or they were literally torn down. And there began to be some clamorings from some of our more liberal folks, particularly from the Austin area, who decided, oh, well, there's a monument right up there in Williamson County. Let's go up there and see if we can't rally the populace to take it down as well. So it was a part of their ideology that this stood for certain things that it doesn't, but in their mind it did, and wanted to join their bandwagon across the nation in trying to score a victory and having this particular monument taken down. So we took it upon ourselves to draw a line in the sand and say, hey, we've got a lot vested in this. Our forefathers certainly had a lot vested in it, and so why should we just capitulate, sit back and let them destroy something that was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy back in 1916. It was pretty important to them, and we can discuss reasons why. But it'd been around for 105 years, I think, at that point, and we decided we needed to protest against the protesters.
So the monument that's there, and I think it's a pretty handsome monument myself. I like to see art, and I think it should be left alone. It has a different interpretation for everybody, right? Art does. Tell me a little bit about the memorial itself. Now, that was produced somewhere else, as I understand it, in another state, and it was shipped here. Was it like several monuments just like that went in different places, or was it that a unique monument, but that artist did?
Well, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of monuments were built throughout the country, but especially in the South, under the auspices of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And this was a time when many of those soldiers who had fought the war were passing on. This was 50 years, after the end of the war. So consequently, all of these people were passing on, and their families wanted to make sure that they were remembered. Their sacrifice was remembered. And so that's kind of how it was. Everything that we need to know, or anybody needs to know, is inscribed in stone on the front of that memorial in memory of the Confederate soldiers and sailors, erected under the auspices of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, 1916. That's it. It's an American Veterans Memorial.
And it's part granite, part marble, and part concrete, I guess.
It was built in Marietta, Georgia, and as a matter of fact, I was with the Bell County Commissioner's Court on Monday, and some of them did not know that their soldier statue is an exact duplicate of the one here in Williamson County.
But okay, so that same exact statue is in other places.
Correct.
If it hasn't been taken down.
Correct.
Okay, so some people see that and they interpret it a certain way. Well, it must represent the things that they object to, which is why they want things to come down. And to them, let's just deal with it. It represents slavery, that slavery is okay. Do either one of you think slavery is okay today?
Of course not.
Do you think that there were Confederates back in the day who thought slavery was okay?
No, there were abolitionists on both sides of the country. Of course, more in the North and in the South. It was a way of it was the way of the times. It was part of the culture. It was entwined in how all Southerners lived. It had been around since the 1600s. It was legal. We often ask people, if you were to transport yourself back to 1860, do you think you would believe the same things you do today? And more often they would say, well, probably not.
Yeah, I think people look at gay marriage a lot different now than they used to. And this is what drives me personally. What upsets me is when people use today's standards and judge people 150 years ago. And I think it's totally unfair. And I don't think that should be a reason for your argument.
No, and in 1916, when this was erected, there were 5 UDC, what they call chapters, here in Williamson County alone. Now there's 0. There's only 1 in Austin, and I think 1 in Burnett County now that still exists. When they chose to purchase and erect and give this to the county, and at its dedication in November of 1916, there were close to 5,000 people on the town square to see this unveiling. That would be like 100,000 people today. And that's how important this was to them at this particular time.
Yeah. And there were probably African Americans, black people, who were here in Williamson County who may or may not thought that this was a good event, right? We recognize that or not?
Sure, absolutely.
Sure, absolutely. Because
just back then, people have to recognize that there were up to 16,000 blacks who fought for the South or served in the South during that period of time.
Yeah.
Some people are incredulous to that, and that's a fact, along with other diverse backgrounds. People are always asking us about that, and we share with them the fact that not only blacks that fought with the Confederacy, but Jews, Native Americans, women, who am I leaving out? Hispanics, and they all fought together. And they shoulder to shoulder in most cases, whereas the North segregated their black soldiers from their white soldiers, and that's something that was predominant during and after the war.
I think so that's one criticism that you get about why it needs to come down is that issue of, well, it represents slavery for a lot of people, and that's one argument. The other argument has to do with that it's on a public government land. Can you help shed some light on how it got where it's at? So why was that spot chosen? Obviously, somebody in charge of the government at that point in time said, it's okay, let's do this. Just like I know the government a lot of times allows private contractors, they have relationship with private groups all the time. Now, we can go into that. That's a whole other discussion. Give me the background on that if you know it.
Well, at the time, all town squares were the central body of government and activity. It's where all the shops were, it's where the banks were, everything revolved around the county courthouse for the most part. So when these began to be erected, I'm assuming that most of these women decided, let's put it where it's going to be the most prominent place and where it would be seen by people. So in most cases, those were deeded to, or they were, I guess, gifted to the county, to the counties of the time, because they wanted to place them there on the town square. And in each of these counties, the county commissioner's court, at least in Texas, the county commissioner's court has jurisdiction over these monuments now, because it is on county property. Now, 3 steps away is city property. So you've got to know where you are at any given time.
Okay, so because of where it's located, it's on county property. It's the county commissioners who, if somebody could say, hey, let's keep it or let's move it, they would be the ones that would have that jurisdiction. That's pretty much established.
They have the what I call the first dibs on it.
Yeah.
But it's not the final word, because the Texas Historical Commission in Austin really has the final say as to the decision to relocate or whatever for a memorial.
And there are instances where they have overridden a county's desire to remove a statue. Doesn't happen too often, but that is a possibility that the Texas Historical Commission say, wait, let's put the brakes on this.
Yeah.
Plus, there's always a financial aspect to this. Even if it's voted to be taken down, someone's got to pay for that, and that becomes a political hot potato as well. Some of these monuments cost as much as $100,000 and $200,000 to remove.
Yeah. Well, my question to some of the people that want these things removed is, well, will you pay for it? Well, will you? Like, well, no. Well, okay. Well, but it's I mean, at some point, the government body said it's okay to be here. Way back then, 1916. And now here we are today in 2023 with a whole different culture, whole different group of people. But somebody that erected that had a certain purpose and a certain mission for it. And you guys have already stated earlier because it's written on there, what you believe is what the purpose is today. That's what you want people to take away today, is that, nothing else.
Well, that's what it meant back in that day.
Because you believe that's what it meant. Even though
It's
there's people that say
equivalent to
it
the
didn't.
Vietnam Memorial. We tell people all the time, the Vietnam Memorial, that was a very
yeah.
unpopular war,
Yeah.
and yet 58,000 soldiers died
Yeah.
in that conflict. There's a monument now in Washington, D.C. You don't find a bunch of protests around that monument, and even if you disagree with the purpose of it or what it represents. So people have options, and if they disagree with something, even the Supreme Court decision has said if you disagree with something like a monument, you need to turn around and walk the other direction, because just because you disagree with it doesn't mean that the masses disagree with it.
Yeah, well, but a lot of places they're deciding to take some of these long-standing monuments down, which is a little scary. Where does it end, right?
Well, our
where does it-
opposition says they want it to go to a cemetery, or they want it to go to a museum. There are others who say we just want to see it reduced to kitty litter. And so you've got these factions out there that want it removed one way or another. But our argument against moving it to cemeteries is that it certainly would be a target there, as it has been in other cemeteries, especially in Texas, in the Austin area. They've been defaced, Confederate monuments in the cemeteries where it would be easy enough to do. And museums just aren't big enough. That thing is, 35 feet tall or something? It's not easy to just relocate to inside of a museum. But a lot of people would say the land around the courthouse is an outdoor museum. There are other monuments there. There are other statues there.
Sure. Well, and there may be more because somebody else may come along and say, well, let's create this artwork or monument for something else. And the public may say, yeah, we'd like. Of course, you're not going to get 100% agreement on that. But if enough people seem to be for it. I guess that's my next question is, you guys have been there. You've had all these people walking by for all these many, many months. I've been there myself, and I've witnessed this. And people from other parts of the country, but also other countries coming in. What's your take? I mean, if they were to take a vote, what do you believe would be the vote? Well, let's just so it'd be all of Williamson County people if they put it up for a vote. You guys have interacted with so many of these families. What do you think? How do you think the vote would come down? I'm just curious from your own perspective.
Well, from my own perspective and experience and speaking with people and their enthusiasm level, that I feel confident that if the vote were held today, that 70% of this county would vote to retain the memorial right where it is, as it is.
And some of that might be attributed to you guys. Because I'll tell you one thing, I mean, really, when people believe in something, they can explain it to me rationally. I really appreciate, I may not agree with it, but I so appreciate people that take the time and the effort to say, look, let me just give you the nuances of the history so you can better understand it instead of just going with the flow of some of this, anti-monument woke mob stuff.
We've had a lot of folks who come up and tell us, I don't have anything good to say about the Confederates, but it's part of our history and it needs to remain.
Yeah.
And we may have different interpretations, but the fact that it's a very important part of our history. We are still living with the consequences today, and that is what they believe.
Yeah.
You should talk to some of the people who come from Eastern Europe and from Ukraine and Russia, and they are astounded that monument is at risk to be taken down. And they say, if we could tell you what that means to us.
I have, that's interesting, Tommy. I've had this conversation with people that have come from other parts of the world, especially Europe. And some of them have told me, Mr. Rickey, I'm seeing what's going on here in America, what happened in these totalitarian states I came from, where all of a sudden you started shutting down this other way of thinking or talking or free speech or getting rid of monuments. And there's only one political way to look at things. And this is what you have to do, and everything else gets destroyed, moved away. Be careful. They're shutting up your speech. And this is the start. And then it gets even bigger, grows bigger. And you guys are fighting against that, and I appreciate it. Because there are no perfect, here's another example I like to use with some people on this issue. I go, many of us believe that there should be Buffalo Soldier monuments because they've got I love their history. I've read up on it. I think it's really cool. But there are Native American groups that really don't like it, don't want them erected or want them coming down. How do you feel about that? My position would be I'd still like to see it. Yes, I know it's not perfect. In my own family, we have French. We're French Canadians. I'm part of my family. And if anybody understand the British and the French and what they went through, they're from Arcadia. And there was a movement where the British got rid of all the Arcadians, which were all the French, and they all had to leave. They did some horrible things to them. So if you're up in the Nova Scotia area where I have family, you see all these monuments for all these, all the British, soldiers and aristocrats, and you know what they did. You may not like that either because of a history, but it's there, it represents something. You go, what can I learn from this?
Exactly.
And that's what scares me about just getting rid of everything and wiping it all clean. You know what I mean? I'm not so sure that that's a good thing for us either. Let me ask you this: is there any compromise that you see for this issue on where it's at? Could it? I mean, you said you don't want to go to a cemetery. You don't want it moved, but is there some other compromise that you think could be possible? Or you go, no, there's no compromise. It needs to stay right where it's at.
Let me give you an example, sir, from 2015, when the last dust-up was, and they were talking about the relocation or putting up plaques, and in this case, well, let's put up another monument to, kind of do a little counter to the Confederate memorial. And
you mean to sanitize it somehow?
Well, it depends on how you look at it.
Yeah, I mean...
So I said, okay, what do you have in mind?
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of fond of this statue that's in Barbados. And it's from a very scantily clothed African-American slave, and he's holding his hands up to heaven with shackles, and they are broken.
Okay.
And I said, I don't think that's going to fly in Williamson County. But let me give you an alternative. How about a statue of Dr. James Lee Dickey of Taylor? One of the first African-American doctors in the area, lived in Taylor, and he was twice elected as Citizen of the Year in Taylor, Texas in the 1950s because he was such a strong bridge between the communities. Everybody loved this guy. And I said, if you want to put one up right here beside this Confederate memorial, I will contribute to its erection.
Oh, wow.
So stress the positive rather than the negative.
Stress the positive, right.
And he's from Williamson County.
Absolutely. So it ties in locally.
So the reason I received back, the answer I received back from the opposition was, it doesn't go far enough.
Oh, okay.
I said, we're done.
No, that's how this works, folks. I mean, this is why we should all be cautious about it. Gets started, and then it becomes this big, huge snowball effect, and
So
it just takes everything. It just
table.
sanitizes and wipes out everything, any memory of anything, because nobody's perfect enough anymore.
No, history
got a
is
problem with that.
complicated. It's meanders. There's good and there's bad. There's ugly to what happened here. We need to recognize all of it. And, the people ask us, well, what about Germany? No statues of Hitler in Germany. And then we go, well, that's true, but that's it's apples and oranges. But there are monuments to soldiers in Germany, to the average
Yeah.
German who fought
Right.
during
Yeah.
the war.
Right.
Many,
Right.
many,
World War II.
World War II.
Right.
Many statues.
and people
so
could definitely take
that's
offense
a weak
to that.
argument as far as
Yeah,
we're concerned.
right.
There was a letter in the editor's paper today that said, why don't we put up a Union soldier standing next to the Confederate soldier? And our viewpoint is there's no correlation to that. This was the Confederacy. Certainly there were Northern soldiers who came here after the war and contributed mightily to the growth of this region.
Yeah.
But to put up a Yankee statue just...
Well, we're here in Texas. I mean, Texas has a different history than Massachusetts, where I'm originally from.
Exactly.
Right? And I just don't, I don't want you to do things here in Texas that isn't really about what was the Texas history.
Yeah, just
good or bad.
Yeah, Williamson County was one of the few counties in Texas to vote against secession. They wanted to remain in the Union primarily because they were very fond of the U.S. troops who were manning forts in this area to protect them against the Comanches. And when Texas seceded, the fear was the soldiers, as they did, would flee the state, leaving them open to the to those folks. And of course, that was rectified pretty quickly with the establishment of militias throughout the area to guard them against that. But most people don't know that. That's my point, is that this is stuff that's not often taught.
No.
And people see things from 30,000 feet and they don't want to get into the weeds.
People don't.
And if they did get into the weeds, they would understand a lot more about the opposition.
Now, and people's memories are getting even shorter and shorter with short form videos. Nobody reads anymore. Well, not a lot of people read or really delve into it.
The other thing, Richard, is that we're open to any kind of discussion and debate with anybody who wants to come up, as long as they're cordial.
Yeah.
We'll sit there and talk to them as we have, 2 or 3 hours to one individual, answer their questions.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they still may not agree with us, but they appreciate the dialogue.
Yeah, that's what we want. Orenda Education is in the education business. We run a lot of schools, and I tell people all the time, what's the purpose of education? They ask me, and I say the purpose of education, in my opinion, is to teach kids how to be critical thinkers, how to think for themselves, how to go get information, how to be organized. Don't just take somebody's word for it because they're an adult or because they're wearing a gray soldier's uniform or a Union soldier's uniform or whatever. You go and this is how you do it. And so I hope that we've got kids that'll watch this and go, well, I really appreciate hearing Mr. Turner and Mr. Little's view of this. Now I'm going to go listen to the other side, and I'm going to make my own judgment based on my information that I've gathered. And I really appreciate that. Do you guys get to go talk to school groups about your history?
We'd be happy to, but unfortunately the public school system frowns upon historians like ourselves and organizations like us, and so the woke culture is now barring groups like us from going and talking. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, we used to participate quite extensively with many of the junior ROTC programs here in the county, and once a year would go in and provide books on leadership authored by Robert E. Lee to these students and give them other items of interest, other awards, and the military put the kibosh on that and told these schools that they could not do that anymore. So maybe that'll come back around. We're hoping.
I hope it comes back. Just because of your history and your uniform and you can't go in there and just give your point of view. It just, kids miss out on that. That's sad. That's just a sad state.
And we tell people all the time, don't believe a word we say.
Yeah, no.
Go and research it yourself. And we have yet to have one person come back and go, well, you were totally wrong.
You were wrong on
issues.
this one. Yeah.
So,
many of the military science instructors in the junior ROTC programs here in the county have, they've written me and said, we are so sorry about this.
Yeah.
But as basically soldiers / employees of the federal government, we're following orders. And here's the paper that we got from the Navy Chief of Staff or the Commandant, whoever. It says, no, you will not any longer have any association with these guys, specifically Sons of Confederate Veterans. But we aren't the only ones.
no.
But it was targeted at us as they have for the last several years.
Yeah.
So the line employees would probably love to have us come in and
Yes.
help educate, and it's always the leadership that can restrict us from doing that.
Well, I'll probably have people that'll say, "Well, I can't believe you had them on this podcast," and I'll go, "No, exactly. In fact, I want to have the groups that don't agree with you guys to come on here,
We hope you do.
and I'm gonna pick their brain as well and ask them all kinds of
And
questions."
they do get paid, incidentally.
And they do what?
You ask about if we get paid, we do not, but they do. They are
really?
subsidized.
Well, your adversarial groups, I've seen them sometimes. It seems like they're, I don't know, is it Black Lives Matter? Is there, what groups is there some organized group
Yeah,
that
they
you
call
guys see?
themselves different organizations.
So who are some of them? I mean, we know who you are now. We know you're an official group. You guys meet all the time. You're organized. Who else you seen out there?
Go ahead.
Well, they're kind of under the umbrella of an outfit that calls itself the Wilco Patriots, a misnomer if I ever heard one. But they are the cover for a lot of these other, what we would recognize as radical groups, the Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and several of the local groups that are organized on the liberal side of the House. And but it's interesting to me that the head of Confederate Georgetown, he's a black man from New Jersey, former military officer, and in all this 2.5 years we've been there, has really been unable to mobilize any of the black community here to support them, and I think that says a lot.
Yeah. That's interesting. Now, you mentioned that you called them radical group. You did. Some people look at you and say, well, you're radical too. There you are out in front all these weeks and you're wearing your uniform sometimes.
That's
I
fair.
guess you don't all the time. You're a radical group.
That's fair.
What makes them radical and you're not? Or maybe you are, I don't know.
Well, they are supported by different, how should we say, there are different left-leaning organizations throughout the country, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama. We asked one day the group who brought out this really expensive equipment, where did you get the money to get all this stuff? And they said it came from the Bill Gates Foundation. And then they sort of went, I guess we shouldn't have said that. So we don't know if that's true or not. But there are splinter organizations that are under the auspices of these more liberal entities that we're all familiar with, George Soros groups, and so we know that they are getting subsidized for doing this and have been. A large billboard was put up on Interstate 35, sponsored by the Southern Poverty Law Center, that said, please take this monument down in Georgetown. Yeah. And it was up for more than a month, and that was pretty expensive. So there are factions against us, and they're willing to spend a lot of time and money to get their way.
Yeah, interesting. Let's delve a little bit into the issue that I think that the one that always sticks out, and the reason why people are they object the most to this is just, well, you're supporting slavery, or there's a difference in the races, and this power structure that people want to see removed, they believe. So let me just ask you, do you think you guys are prejudiced? Do you think you're racial? You have racial biases? You too? What about you?
Well,
do you?
I don't think more than anybody else, but to your point, sir, as Tommy touched on earlier, is that I don't think people realize that when the war ended in the summer of 1865, slavery was abolished in the South. As we all know, here on the 19th of June, Juneteenth, that it was ended here in Texas, and we were on basically the last ones over here to the frontier. But slaves remained slaves in some of those states that were still in the Union, although they were entered the Union as slave states. I'm talking specifically about Kentucky and Delaware. They retained their slaves perfectly legally and constitutionally up until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. And so, in all these years, 4 years of incredible carnage, if the war was all about slavery, the North could have ended slavery at any time they wanted to, because there were no Southerners, except for those 5 slave states, that were still in the Union.
Yeah.
So that is when we just say, let's just cut to the chase. Here's the deal.
That's the big part of the issue. When you read the people that make the comments and write into the Williamson County Sun and other magazines and newspapers that want these monuments coming down, they use the argument of slavery. That's the image, and that's what you're portraying, that's okay. And then there's people that say, well, this is a ridiculous view of history, that it wasn't over slavery. You guys would come down and say, well, of course there was some of that back then, but there were other issues that led to, let's call it the Civil War. I know you may call it something else, but discuss those with me just a little bit. What do you think were the other issues, besides the issue of slavery, that contributed to the conflict that we have between the North and the South?
Want to take that one?
Well, I'll take part of it.
Okay, take part. I'll take part.
Well, as in many, if not all wars, economics is always a huge contributing factor, either directly or indirectly. And if we went back through all the wars in history, we would see that. So in 1860, which we kind of use as our benchmark as the time the census came out and things like that, in 1860, the southern states were paying about 75% of the federal budget came from the South, and most of that was in the form of tariffs. Once President Lincoln went into office in March of 1861, they immediately raised the tariff from 20% to 47%, and that's just unbearable, from a business standpoint. So that the North was heavily industrialized, and they were getting a lot of breaks, and the agrarian South was not. So they saw that as a maybe the major issue for a lot of folks, but also I think the 10th Amendment regarding the power of states versus the federal government was also a big thing. Southerners were by nature a very conservative lot, and therefore they wanted to make sure that the power of the individual and the power of their sovereign state was paramount whenever they had issues of a national nature to come up. And Mr. Lincoln, he was much more of a person who was a strong central government advocate and acted accordingly. Slavery did obviously play a part, but it was not the part that caused North and South to start killing each other.
It played a part back then.
So we tell people, keep things in context.
Yeah.
The U.S. Constitution said nothing about the inability to secede. In fact, the forefathers discussed it because the states had never gotten along. The colonies had never gotten along, particularly the northern and the southern colonies. And so they always felt like that was a possibility, and it was up to the states to make sure that didn't happen. But as we tell people, the only difference between the fact that Texas pretty much seceded from Mexico, the colonists we know seceded basically from the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And so why couldn't the South secede from the North? And the only different issue in all those three is that the South lost their plans to secede.
Well, it was in the Constitution you could succeed. I mean,
Yes.
one of the criticisms of Lincoln that some people have, and I think it's been mostly Southerners, is that he used the power of the federal government to get what he needed, which part of what he wanted was obviously to preserve the Union, to preserve everybody. And so he used the bully pulpit of the federal government and the Union soldiers. I mean, he used the power. So I keep saying, the Confederates are outnumbered substantially.
Yeah.
And then they also had more money for their weapons and their cannons and everything else. So he was the first one who said, you know what, even a lot of it wasn't constitutional. And that debate's still going on now. Is the power of the presidency, and the power of the federal government. It used to be itsy bitsy teeny weeny federal government. And that's what the founders of the Constitution obviously wanted. And that's why we have the amendment to arm yourself against who? Who should you fear more than anybody? Well, the government. That's what the founders believed because they had that experience with Britain. So that was already baked in. So one of the criticisms of Lincoln that I've heard and read about, that I've heard especially from Southerners, is that, wow, man, he used this big, bully pulpit of the federal government and went above his constitutional authority and said, oh, I'm doing all of this. And then people have even questioned how he really what his position was against slavery. And you can read a lot of things he wrote, and clearly he believed that slavery wasn't okay. In other places, because he was probably just saying what he needed to politically to pull this thing together. So we can get into that debate. But the issue about what was over slavery was over our independence. We wanted to maintain our independence. And if you take away the slavery part, because nobody believes that anymore, everybody knows that's wrong. There's always a few racist people, we know that. But generally, people aren't racist. No. They're not. I don't believe you guys are. I don't believe what you're standing for is. But looking at the history of it, there's this issue about the big federal government versus the ability of the independent states to make their decision and go, you know what, I don't agree with what the feds are doing. So that's one of the criticisms that I've read about that the Southern people on the Southern side have against Lincoln, is that he was using his bully pulpit of the federal government to force things on the South. And that is what you believe a big part of the Civil War was about.
It's about Southern independence, to be left alone. We talk about the misnomer of a Civil War. Civil War connotates two entities trying to create one government. The South didn't want to overtake Washington, D.C. They didn't want to have anything to do with the North. They wanted to be left alone to do their own thing, because even Lincoln disrupted their relationship with the United Kingdom at the time. Britain and France were getting loads of cotton materials from the South, turning it into goods and then sending it back. Well, Lincoln said, the South's getting way too much money for this. We need a piece of that pie. So he started imposing tariffs to the point where it was literally damaging the way of life in the South. The farmers were going broke. There was also the issue of future expansion. Everybody knew that there would be westward expansion. So which states were going to be allowed to keep slaves and which would be free states. There was always that argument in the background. But you're right. Lincoln, in many of his writings, he tried to actually preserve slavery right up to the last moment, because he just wanted his portion of the finances, and the South was just not willing to go along with that. They thought they were being fair as it was.
He definitely believed. I mean, it looked like Lincoln really believed that he needed to preserve the Union in order to help the country economically.
Yes, absolutely. That's
what he believed. So it's this idea the government knows better than you.
Yes.
Right? And I think some of that battle is still going on today.
Absolutely.
I think it still is. I think there's still parts of what we'll call the Civil War that really hasn't gone away. I mean, there's many wars that people lose the war, but they don't give up. Like, well, I might have lost the war in this respect, but some of those issues are still unresolved.
Yeah. Well, President Lincoln, I think, covered a lot of his actions that were problematically unconstitutional under the guise of necessities of war.
Yes.
And the popular thing about, preserving the Union. And, we've had recent experience with the same, it's not exactly the same, but a common thing, such as our recently, I don't know if it's still ongoing or not, the pandemic, where government edicts, whether you want to or not, you're going to be vaccinated and you're going to be following the mandates.
Yeah.
So that probably at future times will say, why did they do that? But it's the same kind of situation.
Yeah. There's some of the things that I think the South stood for that I think are still, a lot of people are still standing for those things today and battling against the big federal government. Those are interesting things.
And would slavery have gone away? We're asked that all the time. We believe that eventually it would have been legislated out. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there wouldn't have been a need for that.
I think over time, again, I don't know. I'm no expert, but I believe over time it would have gone away anyway. I mean, just as we've progressed in our as a society and what we look at, how we look at things from a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, it just would. And then the economics of it wouldn't have. I don't think it would have continued.
Yeah.
As we've seen in so many places, slavery has gone away.
Yeah.
And you know, we weren't the first, but hats off to our country for finally recognizing, let's make it illegal. Okay, good, because it was legal for a long time.
Yeah.
But it was all over the world. And so we've come a long way, and I think over time it probably would have happened. Would we have lost so many lives if we hadn't, you know, if Lincoln hadn't just taken the approach he did, just to preserve the Union?
We
I don't know.
believe Lincoln has the blood of 1 million people on his hands because he was the initiator of this war, and you could spend a lot of time. Just an example, in the summer of 1862, the North was losing the war. They didn't have the best generals. They didn't have the best strategies. They were losing the war, and those around Lincoln, they were always looking ahead, right? So the next election is less than 2 years away. So what can we do to enhance our chances of getting reelected? We need a cause. We need a cause that we can grapple onto. And of course, slavery was always discussed, and they said this is one issue we can grab hold onto in order to garner public support. So they were looking for a winning battle. They couldn't just throw it out there willy-nilly. It would look like a political act. So they waited for a battle to be fought, which did happen in September of 1862 at a place called Sharpsburg in Maryland, which was a northern state. The North calls it Antietam because there was a creek that ran through there called Antietam. It was the single most bloodied day in the history of this country. 23,000 men died or were wounded on both sides in a 12-hour period. That is unfathomable to think about today. But back then, it was still a catastrophe. But it was pretty much a draw. So Lincoln's advisor says, okay, here we go. Here's our chance. Let's go ahead and jump on this and do the Emancipation Proclamation, which he still allowed the South to, if you rejoin the Union by January 1st, we'll let you keep your slaves. I know. So that's a dichotomy to all this.
And this is where I would like our students, when they're studying this, to be able to, you know, study this issue of the monuments, study the issue of what was the causes of the Civil War, also to look at Abraham Lincoln, one of our great presidents, both critically as well as positively. I think some people would argue, if I were Lincoln, I'd say, well, I know it was tough, I dealt with all these things, but what I was trying to do is preserve the Union because I thought it would help the country economically, which is going to better everybody over the long run. Their lives are going to be better, and lives are going to be saved if you projected it out for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So I'd love to have this debate with you guys more. We'll probably have to close it down, but I could argue the other side of what I think Lincoln was trying to do and how he's trying to thread the needle. You know, but in the end, he thought his approach was going to be better in the long run for most people. But in the short term, that's an example of one of the battles where a lot of young people lost their lives. It's just really sad.
700,000 soldiers, probably another 300,000 as a result of wounds following the war, civilian casualties, disease.
And we're looking at this issue in Ukraine right now. It's like we need to have this debate. Could we please have this debate about what's going on there? And is this really what we want to do as a country? But you can't even talk about it, it seems like. You know, we got to shut it right down because what the government's going to do has got to be right. Well, maybe it's not, and I'm a taxpayer. I'd like to at least talk about it. And so we have a discussion. I decide who I want to elect to get in there and make these policy decisions, which are, people are dying over this issue. Could we save some lives if we found some way to negotiate something? I don't know, but these kind of issues are still going on today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. I could talk all day about this stuff. I think it's fascinating. What I hope the takeaway is for all of our kids and our people in our education community is that we're trying to train kids how to think for themselves and to dig and get information and look at both sides. And what I appreciate about you two is that you guys are historians. I mean, I've gotten to know you enough, not just from today's discussion, but also speaking to you out there, that I've learned a lot from you guys. And I appreciate you doing what you're doing. That I think is just, you know what, we're here to educate people and let you decide. So thank you very much for sharing.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, guys.
Turn up.